Before we start, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Maybe you're going through a divorce right now and wondering how to navigate this painful chapter. Maybe you've been through multiple divorces and are still learning hard lessons. Maybe you're curious about what mistakes even successful people make when their marriages fall apart. This conversation is for you. I've been divorced 3 times. 3. Most people get married once, maybe twice. I've had to rebuild my life, my trust, and my understanding of love more times than anyone should have to. Through each divorce, I've learned what works, what doesn't work, and most importantly, what absolutely destroys any chance of healing and moving forward. Today, I want to share the most damaging thing you can do after a divorce, something I did after my first divorce that made everything worse, prolonged my pain, and nearly prevented me from ever trusting again. It's a mistake I see intelligent, successful people make over and over, and it's so tempting that it feels like the natural response to betrayal and heartbreak. Never do this after divorce. Don't try to prove you were right and they were wrong. This sounds simple, but it's the most seductive and destructive trap that divorce sets for you, and I fell into it completely. When my first marriage to Justine ended, I was consumed with the need to prove that I'd been the better partner, the more reasonable person, the one who tried harder to make it work. I wanted everyone, our friends, our families, the lawyers, the world, to see that I was the victim and she was the problem. This need to be right became more important to me than healing, more important than the well-being of our children, more important than building a healthy future. It nearly destroyed me, and it definitely prolonged the pain for everyone involved. Let me tell you why this impulse is so dangerous and what I learned about what actually helps you recover and rebuild after divorce. The first reason you should never try to prove you were right in your divorce is that it requires you to stay emotionally connected to your ex-spouse in the most toxic way possible. Instead of moving toward acceptance and healing, you're constantly reliving the worst moments of your marriage, collecting evidence of their failures, and building your case for why you were the better partner. After my divorce from Justine, I found myself obsessing over every argument we'd had, every compromise I'd made, every time I'd been patient while she was difficult. I would replay conversations in my head, thinking of better comebacks, stronger arguments, more compelling evidence of my virtue and her unreasonableness. This mental rehearsal kept me trapped in the relationship long after it was legally over. I was still fighting the same battles, just in my imagination. I was still trying to win arguments that no longer mattered with someone who was no longer listening. The energy I should have been putting into building my new life was being wasted on relitigating my old one. Every hour I spent mentally proving my case was an hour I wasn't spending on healing, growing, or preparing myself to love again. Worse, this obsession with being right made it impossible for me to learn from what had actually gone wrong. If I was the victim and she was the problem, then I didn't need to change anything about myself. I just needed to find someone who would appreciate my virtues instead of someone who would exploit my kindness. This victim mentality prevented me from doing the hard work of examining my own contributions to our marriage's failure. It took me years to realize that, regardless of who was more wrong, I had played a role in creating the dysfunction that destroyed our relationship. The second reason to avoid the proving you're right trap is that it turns your divorce into a war instead of a transition. Divorce is painful enough when both people are trying to be civil and fair. When one or both people are trying to win at the other's expense, it becomes a scorched earth battle that destroys everything in its path. I made our divorce unnecessarily adversarial because I needed to establish that I was the wronged party. Instead of focusing on practical matters like custody arrangements and asset division, I found myself fighting about things that had happened years earlier, trying to get legal validation for emotional grievances that had nothing to do with our current situation. This approach made everything more expensive, more time-consuming, and more traumatic for our children. Instead of modeling how to handle conflict with dignity and maturity, I was showing them that when relationships end, the goal is to destroy the other person's reputation and make them pay for their mistakes. The lawyers loved it, of course. Every hour we spent fighting about who had been the better spouse was billable time. Every piece of evidence I wanted to present about her character flaws required research. documentation, and court time. What could have been a straightforward dissolution became a prolonged legal battle that cost us both financially and emotionally. More importantly, the adversarial approach poisoned any possibility of maintaining a functional co-parenting relationship. Instead of divorcing someone I had once loved and with whom I needed to raise children, I was at war with an enemy who I needed to defeat. This made every interaction about power and control rather than about our children's well-being. Every conversation became an opportunity to score points rather than solve problems. Every decision about custody or parenting became a battle where someone had to win and someone had to lose. The third reason to avoid trying to prove you're right is that it prevents you from processing the real emotions of divorce: grief, loss, fear, and disappointment. Instead of feeling these difficult but necessary emotions, you stay stuck in anger and righteousness, which are easy to experience but don't lead to healing. When I was focused on building my case against Justine, I didn't have to face the reality that I had failed at something important to me. I didn't have to grieve the loss of the future we had planned together. I didn't have to confront my fears about whether I was capable of maintaining a long-term relationship. Anger and righteousness are seductive because they give you energy and make you feel powerful. Grief and disappointment are vulnerable emotions that make you feel weak and uncertain. But those vulnerable emotions are the ones that actually move you through the divorce process toward acceptance and peace. By staying angry and focused on her wrongs, I avoided dealing with my own sense of failure and loss. I postponed the grief work that was necessary for healing, which meant it hit me even harder later when I could no longer avoid it. I remember the day this really became clear to me. I was having lunch with a friend who had been through his own difficult divorce, and I was explaining all the ways Justine had been unreasonable during our marriage. He listened patiently for about 20 minutes, then asked me a question that stopped me cold. When are you going to start missing her instead of hating her? That question broke something open in me. I realized that I hadn't allowed myself to miss the good parts of our relationship, to grieve what we had lost together, to feel sad about the family structure our children would never have. I had been so busy being right that I hadn't let myself be human. The fourth reason to avoid the proving you're right trap is that it makes you toxic to future relationships. Nobody wants to date someone who is still fighting their last relationship. Nobody wants to hear endless stories about how terrible your ex-spouse was and how much better you deserved. I discovered this the hard way when I started dating again. I thought women would be sympathetic to my story about how difficult Justine had been, how much I had sacrificed for our marriage, how unfairly I had been treated. Instead, they were put off by my bitterness and my obvious inability to take responsibility for my own choices. Smart women could see that if I was still angry at my ex-wife years after our divorce, I probably wasn't emotionally available for a new relationship. If I couldn't speak about the mother of my children with basic respect, how would I speak about them if our relationship ended? My need to be right about my first marriage made me look weak and bitter rather than strong and wise. It signaled that I was still controlled by my past rather than free to create my future. It suggested that I would bring the same blame-focused mentality to any new relationship. It wasn't until I stopped trying to prove that Justine was wrong and started focusing on what I wanted in my future that I became attractive to the kind of women I wanted to attract. When I could speak about my divorce as a learning experience rather than a victimization, I started having much better conversations and connections. The fifth reason to avoid trying to prove you're right is that it teaches your children terrible lessons about how to handle conflict, failure, and relationships. Children are always watching how their parents behave, especially during crises. The way you handle your divorce will shape their understanding of love, commitment, and how people should treat each other when things go wrong. When I was focused on proving that I was right and Justine was wrong, I was teaching my children that when relationships fail, the goal is to assign blame rather than take responsibility. I was showing them that love is conditional and that when someone disappoints you, the appropriate response is to destroy their reputation. I was also teaching them that their mother was a bad person, which put them in an impossible position. Children need to be able to love both their parents even when those parents can't love each other. When I made Justine the villain in our story, I was asking my children to choose sides in a conflict they didn't create and couldn't resolve. This created enormous anxiety and confusion for them. They loved us both, but they could see that I needed them to validate my version of events and condemn hers. This put pressure on them to lie about their feelings or betray one parent to please the other. It took me too long to realize that my children's emotional health was more important than my need to be vindicated. When I finally stopped trying to prove that their mother was wrong and started focusing on being the best father I could be, regardless of what she did or didn't do, my relationship with my children improved dramatically. They could finally relax and just be kids instead of feeling like they had to manage their parents' emotions and take sides in a conflict they didn't understand. So what should you do instead of trying to prove you're right after divorce? First, focus on what you can control going forward rather than relitigating what went wrong in the past. You can't change your ex-spouse's behavior during the marriage, but you can control your own behavior during and after the divorce. You can choose to be dignified, fair, and focused on practical solutions rather than emotional vindication. This doesn't mean being a doormat or failing to protect your interests. It means choosing your battles based on practical importance rather than emotional satisfaction. Fight for custody arrangements that serve your children's needs. Fight for financial settlements that are fair and sustainable. Don't fight to prove that you were the better spouse. Second, take responsibility for your own contributions to the marriage's failure, even if your ex-spouse won't take responsibility for theirs. This isn't about accepting blame you don't deserve. It's about empowering yourself to make different choices in the future. I eventually realized that while Justine and I had both made mistakes during our marriage, I had chosen to marry her, chosen to stay married to her through various difficulties, and chosen to handle conflicts in ways that often made things worse rather than better. Taking responsibility for these choices gave me power to make different ones going forward. Third, get professional help to process the emotions of divorce in a healthy way. A good therapist can help you work through grief, anger, disappointment, and fear without getting stuck in victimhood or blame. They can help you understand your patterns in relationships and develop better tools for handling conflict and communication. I resisted therapy for a long time because I thought it was for weak people who couldn't handle their problems alone. This was stupid pride that cost me years of unnecessary pain. When I finally started working with a therapist, I learned tools for managing my emotions and understanding my behavior that made every aspect of my life better. Fourth, practice speaking about your ex-spouse with basic respect, especially in front of your children. This doesn't mean pretending the divorce was mutual or that there were no problems. It means acknowledging that you were married to this person for good reasons, that the relationship had value even though it didn't last, and that they deserve basic human dignity even though you're no longer together. This is incredibly difficult when you're angry and hurt, but it's one of the most important gifts you can give your children. It shows them that people can disagree and even hurt each other without becoming enemies. It demonstrates that love and respect don't have to be all or nothing propositions. Fifth, focus your energy on building the life you want rather than destroying the reputation of the person you used to be married to. Use the pain and disappointment of divorce as motivation to become a better person, a better parent, and eventually a better partner. After my first divorce, once I stopped trying to prove that Justine was wrong, I started asking different questions. What kind of father do I want to be? What did I learn about myself during this marriage? What qualities do I want to develop to be happier and more successful in future relationships? These questions led to much more productive actions than my previous focus on documenting Justine's flaws and building my case for why I was the victim. Look, I understand the temptation to prove you're right after divorce. When someone you trusted hurts you, when a relationship you invested in fails, when your family structure collapses, it's natural to want some kind of validation that you weren't crazy, that your efforts mattered, that you deserved better treatment. But seeking this validation through proving your ex-spouse was wrong is like drinking poison and expecting them to get sick. It hurts you more than it hurts them, it prolongs your pain, and it prevents you from building the life you actually want. I learned this lesson the hard way, but I did learn it. My second and third divorces were handled very differently. Instead of trying to prove that Tallulah was wrong, I focused on what I could learn from our relationship's failure and how I could be a better partner in the future. This approach didn't eliminate the pain of divorce, but it made the process much faster, less expensive, and less traumatic for everyone involved. More importantly, it allowed me to maintain respect for someone I had loved and to model healthy conflict resolution for my children. Divorce is one of the most difficult experiences human beings face. It represents the death of dreams, the failure of hopes, the collapse of the future you thought you were building. The pain is real, the grief is legitimate, and the anger is understandable. But turning that pain into a campaign to prove your ex-spouse was wrong will only prolong your suffering and prevent your healing. The goal of divorce should be to end your marriage in a way that allows both people to build healthy, happy lives apart. That can happen when one or both people are focused on winning a war instead of transitioning to a new chapter. Your ex-spouse's opinion of you doesn't determine your worth. Your ability to prove they were wrong doesn't determine your value. Your future happiness doesn't depend on getting vindication for past hurts. What determines your post-divorce success is your ability to process your emotions in healthy ways, learn from your mistakes, take responsibility for your choices, and focus your energy on building the life you want rather than destroying the reputation of the person you used to be married to. I know this is easier said than done. I know the urge to prove you're right feels overwhelming when you're hurt and angry. But I'm telling you from experience, that path leads to years of wasted energy, prolonged pain, and missed opportunities for growth and happiness. Choose healing over winning. Choose growth over vindication. Choose your future over your past. Your ex-spouse may never admit they were wrong, but you can still be right about what matters most, how you choose to move forward. Share this with someone who needs to hear that healing is more important than winning. Subscribe if these conversations help you think differently